Halito Chimachugma, this is Chief Steve coming at y'all with another episode of True Story. Just wanted to take this time out to say Yokoki, thank you to all of my subscribers, all of y'all that's been rocking with me since day one, and those who have just recently got on. I appreciate and cherish each and every one of you guys. Our community is now over 400 strong, and we are still growing as we speak. So continue to like these videos, continue to share these videos, and just understand the more that we get eyes to these videos, the more that we will continue to grow and we continue to wake our people up and knowing who we truly are. All right. So once again, Yokoki, I thank y'all and I appreciate y'all from the bottom of my heart. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started with the continuation of this series. Alrighty, y'all, this is the book that we've been in, The First Americans, 1607 through 1690, by Thomas Jefferson, Word Baker, born 1879 through 1966, publication date 1927. We're going to go ahead and come up here and leave off, or continue where we left off, which was chapter 2, the land and labor in the tobacco colonies. And I showed you guys the different tobacco Indians and who they were dealing with around this time, the different colonies, and how hard and how much of a struggle it was for these colonies to first get established and, get the ball rolling. So at this point, they realized that they can't do the same thing that they did in exploiting other different, countries and continents out here in America. They can't do that. They had to adapt to our land. They had to adapt to our geographical climate, our culture, everything of that nature. So they realize now, this is a rich tobacco land. This is agricultural land, and our mother will be respected. So the cultivation became a prominent part within these different colonies, and we're going to read on and see how that played a part in growing the colonies, and on top of that, who exactly were the freemen and who exactly were the indentures and everything of that nature. Because the whole point of this series is showing our people that us as the Aboriginal copper-colored Indians, as the American Indians, we were not African slaves. We were not slaves from Africa. The copper-colored people that were out here today and back then and out here today are not slaves from Africa. Okay, so that's going to show you a little more deeper into this. And, like I said, this is something that you have to have the eyes to see and the ears to hear, because, this isn't something that was taught to us in school. Not a lot of us knew about this. And you got to be patient with some people and, really see things for what they are. Okay. So as we go into this, make sure that you're paying close attention, take notes if you have to, and make sure you further your research as well. And I'm going to be sprinkling a little more images and details and, as much as I can. And like I said, this series is going to go for a little bit, so we can really get the bread and butter as to who were coming over here and who was doing what they were doing back in these days. All right, so without further ado, let's jump into this. All right. This is chapter 2, Land and Labor in the Tobacco Colonies. It says, the settlers in Virginia, as we have seen, were not long in discovering that their soil was peculiarly suited for the cultivation of tobacco. When Captain Newport first sailed up the James, the English, who were accustomed to the product of the Spanish West Indies, considered the native leaf poor and weak and not of the best kind. All right, so the tobacco that they were getting in the West Indies, it wasn't hitting like they wanted it to. But in 1612, Captain John Rolfe, the future husband of Pocahontas, by setting out a small crop and curing it according to the best methods being the Indians' method in the Virginias, produced tobacco which Ralph Hammer considered as strong, sweet, and pleasant as any other under the sun. Okay, so I'm gonna show y'all real quick who was really cultivating this tobacco, because it says John Rolfe was doing it, but we're gonna show you once again who the face of the tobacco was. So let's pause for the cause and let me get you this image here. All right, so here's the image of the true tobacco Indians, the ones who were really cultivating this tobacco for John Rolfe, who showed him how to cure that tobacco right and bump up that quality so that they can really like it. All right, so this is an example of a company that was in Virginia, but as you can see right here, who the real Indians or who the real cultivators of this tobacco were. It was the Aborigines of this land. All right. And shout out to Sosalina once again for sharing this picture, this image on his channel. Y'all be sure to check him out. I really appreciate him sharing that. I'm able to piggyback on a little bit of what he had just showed. So as you can see here, it says, not long after the founding of Jamestown, tobacco distributed in Europe under labels such as this one emerged as the colony's most profitable cash crop. It was Pocahontas's husband, John Rolfe, as we just read, who in 1613 sent part of his crop to London, where it was praised by experts, such as Hammer. 4 years later, 20,000 pounds of tobacco sailed for England aboard the George, prompting a boom in the demand for land in Virginia. Okay, so with that demand for land came more immigrants, more workers, more servants, and we're going to get into that as we go forward in the passage. So let's pause for the cause and let's get back to the book. Alrighty. It says, got a message from my mother-in-law. Let me throw in the do not disturb real quick. Okie dokie. All these notifications, man. It's a lot of stuff going on in the world. Y'all bear with me here. Okay, let's just start right here. It says, immediately the colonists turned to the cultivation of the plant, almost to the exclusion of all else. And at one time, tobacco was seen growing in the very streets of Jamestown. The planter calculated he could do 6 times as well with this crop as with any other. By 1627, the exports of leaf amounted to 500,000 pounds. The English kings and the Board of Trade made repeated efforts to turn the colony away from the all-absorbing culture of this one product, but in vain. Throughout the colonial period, it remained a staple crop of the region surrounding the Chesapeake Bay and almost its sole export. It was inevitable then that tobacco should prove of prime importance in molding the economic and social life of Virginia and Maryland, and to a less extent of North Carolina. The requirements of the plant determined the character of immigration, the labor system, the apportionment of land, the daily life of the planter. Okay? So tobacco was making the world go round at this point for the English and the colonies. It says the greatest need of the tobacco colonies was for cheap labor. All right? And I showed y'all in the last book, or in the last episode, that at one point when they were trying to manufacture things straight for England to England, when they first came out here, the manufacturing of goods, they needed different skilled laborers, and they weren't able to provide for that. They didn't have the means, they didn't have the economic necessities to provide for that. So they've turned to tobacco, which was indigenous to this land, still is, and now they're realizing that they don't need skilled workers for that. So now they can just bring in anybody, right? So again, tobacco requires not skilled hands, but many hands, with land to be had almost for the asking. The only impediment to the rapid accumulation of wealth was the difficulty of securing adequate help in the tobacco field. Had the English during the early years of the 17th century shared in the African slave trade, there can be little doubt that Virginia and Maryland would have been from the first inundated with black workers and the entire region divided up into large estates. So, shows you right there that the English did not engage in the African slave trade during this time, during the 16 to 1700s. Okay. Oh, but in 1619, the first African slaves came out here, and after that, they just kept coming in. And no, it didn't happen like that. There were no African slaves out here like that, if at all. And from my understanding, from the last colonial journals that we had read, a couple of videos back, you can check that out, there were none up until past the 1700s. And those that were coming in that they considered African slaves were actually prisoners of war, indigenous people that were prisoners of war who were shipped off of the mainland into the plantations of the Caribbeans and were reclassified as Africans and then shipped back out from the Caribbeans to the mainland and other different places where they were not originally from and were brought in as the slaves. And they were labeled as African slaves. Okay, and if you want some more information on that, continue to do your research. And there's plenty of people that have made videos on that. So by all means, go ahead and search that out. Okay. But they're talking about, in particular, they're talking about this slave, the African slave trade, which are, where Europe and, different parts of Europe, such as Spain and, different parts of Europe were going on to the coast of Africa, and they were bringing Africans. They were enslaving Africans and taking Africans from Africa to Europe and back and forth, and then they were bringing them out to different places that were, established under their colonial rule or whatever. But the English did not participate, so therefore there were no African slaves, so-called African slaves, or any type of Africans in the American colonies at this point, particularly in Virginia and Maryland, the Chesapeake Bay area in which the first colonies were established. Okay, so we're just gonna go ahead and let the book speak for itself. And we'll start again. Had the English during the early years of the 17th century shared in the African slave trade, there can be little doubt that Virginia and Maryland would have been from the first inundated with black workers and the entire region divided up into large estates. But at this time, slaves in large numbers were not to be had. And we know that slaves, like we said, majority of slaves that were out here, were prisoners of war. They were, or considered foreign criminals. And indigenous people who were, like I said, prisoners of war. They were captured and they were, shipped to different parts of Turtle Island in order to be isolated and made as workers, as slaves. Okay, and they served out life sentences there. So the Dutch, the Spaniards, and the Portuguese monopolized the trade. And by monopolize the trade, they monopolized the African slave trade. Let me check my thing here, make sure we're still going. Yeah, we're still going. I don't know where that error network thing is coming from, but y'all ignore that. As long as we're still going, it's all good. But it says here, they monopolized the trade, and woe to the English ship which ventured too near their stations on the Guinea coast. A few enterprising planters succeeded in stocking their estates with slaves, even before the middle of the century. So there were some that did take on some foreign criminals or those that were indigenous, that were prisoners of war. Okay? There were some that took in some slaves, even before the middle of the century. Notice they didn't say African slaves, because nobody was coming out here from Africa. All right? And by so doing, laid the foundations of large fortunes. But for 100 years, the number of Negroes was insignificant. All right? So they considered Negroes slaves at this point. And you would see, if you look at the different censuses and different Congress acts, you would see that that was one of our classifications out here. The American Indian was classified as slaves at one point in time. Okay, so you'll see in a lot of these older books that slave and Negro are interchangeable in a lot of cases. Okay, that doesn't mean that they came from Africa. That was a narrative that was thrown on later on. But of course, we know it's not true. Virginia and Maryland had to solve their labor problem in some other way. Naturally, they turned their eyes to the unemployed of the mother country. At this time, England was overflowing with indigent persons who worked for meager wages, if indeed they could find work at all. Okay, so without any African slaves, not enough Negroes, not enough Indians, prisoners of war, to do their work, they resorted to going back to their mother country, going to England, and getting unemployed workers out there to try to, bring them out here to work. In 1622, a distinguished minister declared that often the ablest London workers complained to him that though they and their families wore away their flesh with long and excessive labor, they could hardly keep breath in their bodies. In 1610, Rutland County fixed the annual wages of a plowman at 50 shillings, of an ordinary workman at 40 shillings, of a skilled woman worker at 26 shillings and 8 pence, of a female drudge at 16 shillings. Okay, so they were barely getting pennies on the dollar, basically, in today's day and age. They were barely getting pennies on the dollar, and if you were a female and you were a less experienced female, you got the tail end of the wages. It's kind of like today, honestly, how they treat the labor system, and women should be getting paid equal to equal value, or according to their experience, but they should be all on the same equal page as the men. But if you see this right here, you see that not a lot has changed. Prices have gone up, but the system is still in itself the same in so many ways. Had the Virginia planters been able to secure labor at such prices, they would have flooded the world with tobacco and reaped a tremendous profit. So not a lot of people was even working for that, like that. And it says, but it was no easy matter to transport thousands of laborers from the farms and towns of England to the planters on the James and the Potomac. Okay, the fare was from 6 to 10 pounds sterling. Some so far above the means of the poor English laborer as to make the voyage impossible for him unless some scheme were devised to advance him credit. See, so now they're running game on their own people. They're running game on their poor. They'll say, well, we'll pay for you guys to get out here because we know you can't pay for it, but you're going to have to do a little something for us. And this was what it was. The scheme took the form of the indenture. All right, so that's how you got the start of indentured labor out here. And it got it from immigrants who were coming out here, who didn't have anything, who couldn't afford to come out here, but you had these different planters and different companies and sponsors bringing them, paying their fares and having them come out here and basically work their fares off. Excuse me. It says the planters and their agents agreed to pay the immigrants passage to America, and he in turn bound himself to make good the sum by working after reaching the colony. Okay? In this way, the indentured or indented servant, as he was called, sold his labor in the better market. All right? So these were the people who were on the auction block. These were the people who were being sold back and forth and transacted. Okay? It was the foreign immigrant. The foreign immigrant were the ones coming off of ships. You understand? Let's keep going. It would have required a lifetime for him to save enough from his wages in England to pay his fare. But in Virginia, the work of 4 or 5 years was sufficient. True, he had to surrender for this period the liberty so dear to every Englishman. But, and before we go forward, I'm going to read this little caption here on the bottom. It says, when food was not provided by the employer, the amount of these wages was in each instance doubled. It was estimated that the smallest sum upon which a family could be maintained during a period of 12 months was 20 pounds and 11 shillings, including the cost of renting a cottage and the price of the necessary amount of bread, meat, fuel, and clothing. Does that sound familiar? It sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? It's like you have a threshold or an income threshold that you have to meet in order to be able to survive out here. And if you couldn't, if your worker couldn't provide you food, then they had to bump up your prices so that you can be able to pay for your food and pay for your rent and everything of that nature. So you had people out there renting, you had people out there working for minimum wage, and you had people out there basically doing like we doing today, right? They literally breaking their backs, working every day just to survive. That is indenture. Okay? So let's get back to the main text. It says, true, he had to surrender for this period the liberty so dear to every Englishman, right? Which is basically that freedom of owning land, this, that, and the other. It says, but the compensations were great. When his service was completed, he found himself a freeman in a new country. What? He found himself a freeman in a new country where land was cheap, wages high, and advancement rapid. The foreigner, the immigrant, was the freeman. Again, the foreigner, the immigrant, found himself a freeman in a new country where land was cheap, wages high, and advancement rapid. Okay? So, we are not even considered freemen. Okay? We are not freemen. I know a lot of people get, confused with being a freedman, and a free person of color. Okay? You got to understand the difference between those. You got to do your research. But I know a lot of people keep saying, we're the freedmen, Label yourself as a freedman. No. It's a reason why that's not even a subject of ethnicity or anything of that nature today. Okay, this was a foreign term for a foreign people. We were not the freemen. We were the Indians. We still are the Indians. All right? And we were later called free people of color as well. All right? That means that we were free from taxes. We didn't pay taxes. This is our land. But let's continue on forward. This system of immigration was the foundation of the economic life of the tobacco colonies. All right, give me 1 second. Let me pause for the calls. I hear my wife calling me. Alrighty, y'all. So let's continue. It says this system of immigration was the foundation, of the economic life of the tobacco colonies for almost a century. The English manufactured goods, which were the chief imports of Virginia and Maryland, were far less bulky than their exports of tobacco. So that on every vessel which left England for the Chesapeake, there was space available for passengers. So every time a shipment of manufactured goods were to go out to England, the little bit that they were to, create, as they went out to England and they unloaded, there was a lot of empty space. And that is where the foreigners came, the immigrants came in, the unemployed Englishmen came in. All right. They got on the boats. They were the ones getting in the bottom of the boat. They were the ones that were coming in on the ships. Okay. So that BS fairy tale that they like to say that, they took millions of, and now it's not even millions anymore. Now they've limited. They try to limit it down to a couple thousand for a few thousand. So and so many thousand of Africans that came. They were all on ships and they were underneath the boats and they had to do this and do that in order to survive, to get out there. And that's all It's all BS. Roots is a fairy tale, okay? It did not happen. That is literally just a book. It's just a fairy tale. It's just a movie. Roots did not happen. I'm sorry to tell y'all, but Kunta Kinte is no realer than Santa Claus. All right? So let's keep on going. Just keep this in your mind as we going. All right? It says the indentured servant became a regular part of the cargo. Okay? They were the ones coming in. They were the ones that were considered human cargo. They were the ones considered human chattel. All right? The indentured servant became a regular part of the cargo, and the incoming fleet never failed to bring its annual supply. Not until the influx of Negro slaves at the end of the century finally satisfied the need of the planters for cheap labor did this tide of immigration cease. So, not until the Negro slaves, did it say African slaves? No, it said Negro slaves, which means that they were grabbing grabbing indigenous people, copper-colored aborigines here on the mainland and those that were in the Caribbean. They started bringing them in, and once the influx came in, it wasn't an immigration, it was an influx of Negro slaves. Until that happened, until they started capturing and bringing them into, working out there, not until that happened is when the tide of immigration ceased. Okay, and that didn't happen until the 1700s, basically. So, well after, you know what I mean? After the fact. But still, as you see, Negro slaves, not African slaves. Okay? To Virginia alone, there came annually from 1500 to 2000 in the years of 1635 to 1705, talking about immigrants, foreigners, settlers, making a total for these 7 decades of from 100,000 to 140,000. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's around the same number that they're trying to say is so-called African slaves came out here. But you see right here, these were foreign immigrants. These were Englishmen and those who resided in England. I'm sorry. All right, so let's keep going. The men and women who availed themselves of the indenture to better their fortunes in the New World were, for the most part, neither menials nor criminals. All right, so those were the ones that they considered the indentured, were those they didn't have criminals or they weren't considered criminals or menials in that nature. Said a certain portion of undesirable persons joined the movement, but the bulk were poor laborers who were no longer content to work in misery and rags in England while opportunity beckoned from across the Atlantic. Okay, so they had a few prisoners of war with them. They had, not prisoners of war, but they just had a few prisoners. And most of their prisoners were people who were in debt out there. And I have a little short clip to show you guys a little later. That's a whole nother video in itself. So, we'll bring more clarity to that as we go forward. But yeah, boom, the English were the ones coming in cargo ships. And not even cargo ships, these were sailboats that were used for cargo, and they were considered, used for the manufactured goods, and then they were considered cargo. They were on the manifest as cargo, coming on these sailboats from the 1600s, from England to America. All right? So we did not make that. We did not make that boat trip across the Atlantic. It wasn't us. It was the foreigner. The foreigner had to become indentured and become the freeman, not the American Indian. The American Indian was already free out here. We were fighting a war. We were fighting for our freedom here. Okay? As all of this was being established. So let's keep going. Give me 1 second. I'm sorry. Let me pause for the calls. See what's going on here. One more time. Alrighty, I'm back, guys. Got a lot of movement and everything going on. It's early this morning. Well, it's 7:50. People are starting to get up and move around. It's early, but let's continue here. Okay. Among them were men of sturdy mind and sturdy body, eager to aid in the upbuilding of a new country. All right. It says the fact that the term of service for indentured immigrants was short was of the utmost importance for the economic and social life of the tobacco colonies. If we assume that in both Maryland and Virginia, the average was 4 years, and the records prove that this is approximately correct, and the annual number of newcomers 2,500, there might be working in these two colonies at any one time 10,000 servants. So they had at least 10,000 workers working at the time. As the mortality was very heavy, a lot of people were getting unalive and was, passing away. However, and as a certain proportion escaped, so you had some that ran away, and that just shows you what a lot of them look like. You know what I mean? So a lot of them were escaping and they ran away, and they, some went into the different tribes and things of that nature. And they escaped. It says the actual number, and then some they just didn't want to work. That was just their means to get to a new place or get to. So either some tribes took them in, or they went on and lived on their own and scavenged or whatever. However they did that, but it was some that escaped. The actual number was probably smaller because of this. It says Sir William Berkeley estimated the number of servants in Virginia in 1671 at 6,000. Since at the same time he placed the number of slaves at 2,000, there were then in Virginia about 8,000 workers other than freemen, okay, to serve the needs of a population of about 45,000. In other words, more than 82% of the people were free, about 13% were under indenture, and about 5% were slaves. So the slaves were the minority. So that's why I don't agree with the term minority when they call us minorities today. Because how is we as the indigenous people, as those who come from the soil, from this soil, how are we a minority in this land? We're not. Minority is nothing more than a coined term for, or a code for slave, or a code for something that is inferior to what they feel is their superiority. Okay, so don't allow anybody to call you or anybody that you know a minority. Don't allow people that look like us to refer to us as minorities, because we are not. All right. Under these circumstances, even the cheapness of land and the fertility of the soil were not sufficient to build up a large group of wealthy planters. It would have been easy for the well-to-do to accumulate large tracts of land, but there was no object in doing so when it was impossible to secure the labor to put them under cultivation. A few men, possessed of larger capital or greater business acumen than their neighbors, succeeded in overcoming these difficulties and in laying the foundations of fortunes of considerable size. During the last decades of the century, the powerful clique, which centered in the Council of State, was made up chiefly of planters owning several plantations and many servants and slaves. So they had different business tycoons and stuff that started to control and manipulate the economy out there, along with the government. Typical of this group were the elder Nathaniel Bacon, Louis Burwell, William Fitzburg, or Fitzhuff, Fitzhugh, I guess, I don't know, William Byrd II, and Robert Carter. In every river, there are from 10 to 30 men who by trade and industry have gotten very competent estates, wrote Colonel Robert Query in a report to the Board of Trade in 1703. It must be understood that these large planters were possessed of influence in the colony out of proportion to their numbers. The council have vanity enough to think themselves almost upon equal terms with the House of Lords, it was stated, and more than one governor found himself little better than a puppet in their hands. So it's saying it's corruption. The poor planters both respected and feared them. So according to them, it says nothing can be further from the truth, however, than the common belief that in the tobacco colonies during the 17th century, the average plantation was 5,000 acres or more in extent. Okay, so these guys were getting buku land, and they were more land that they had, the more room that they had to rent for more immigrants to come in and work for them. It is true that the proprietor of Maryland, with the purpose of imitating the old manorial system of England, made many large grants in the first years of that colony. In a few cases, the holders of these tracts succeeded in getting a certain proportion of tenants and actually established leet courts. All right, look up what leet courts are. But Lord Baltimore, and probably who they named Baltimore after in the DMV area, soon discovered that it was impracticable to initiate in the wilderness of America a system peculiar to medieval Europe. So what they were doing out there in Europe was not going to fly out here. It says, with land to be had almost for the asking, there was no reason why a man with the ability to shift for himself should voluntarily become a manorial tenant. Okay? It says it became obvious that if Maryland were to attract settlers, land must be granted in fee, simple to all comers, and soon after 1640, land patents were issued in large numbers to small holders. Okay, so you come out here, if you're able to find some work out here, and get some work and work it off, become a freeman, you're able to get land. We'll grant you land. That's basically the stipulation. That's what kept the immigrants coming in, kept the workers coming in. The unemployed, rather. As for the manors themselves, some of them held together until the influx of slaves made it possible to cultivate them profitably. Others began to disintegrate immediately. Most of the indentured servants who came to Virginia and Maryland did so with the intention of becoming freeholders upon the expiration of their terms. The prospect of owning land was held up to them as a principal inducement for leaving England, and in certain cases the indentures stipulated that they were to receive 50 or more acres. So they weren't coming out here unless they were promised at least 50 or more acres after their indenture servitude. In 1648, the Council of Maryland issued an order that every manservant of British or Irish descent shall, at the expiration of the time of their service, be accompted a planter within the said province, and shall have land granted unto them. All right, so you see that British or Irish. These were the people that were coming out here, that were being employed, that were coming off the cargo ships or coming off of the sailboats that were considered cargo, and coming out here and being auctioned off as slaves to different owners, different plantation where they had room for tenancy. Okay, and that's where they became indentures. In Virginia, the servant could claim no such right, but this was not a matter of great importance, for a very small sum would purchase all the land he could put under cultivation. George Alsop, who himself came to Maryland under the terms of indenture, pictures the life and prospects of the servant in a most favorable light. They are no sooner free, he says, but they are ready to set up for themselves, and when once entered, they live surprisingly well. Okay, so a lot of them just wanted to live, just wanted to, And it says right here, each year hundreds of men and women graduated from the class of indentured servants and, as freemen, began the work of establishing for themselves a place in colonial life. Despite the heavy mortality among the newcomers, it seems certain that not less than 100,000 persons completed their terms and became freedmen in the tobacco colonies in the 17th century. All right? Those are freedmen. The freedmen then, rather than the servants, became the most important factor in the industrial structure of this region. Okay? Just how many of those who came over as servants succeeded in accumulating capital, purchasing land, and entering the planter class, it is impossible to say. That thousands did so is amply proved by the records of both Maryland and Virginia. When once established, there was no reason in the period prior to the introduction of slavery why the poor man should not compete successfully with his wealthy neighbor. All right. In some cases, the freedmen, especially in Maryland, became a tenant. See that? So a lot of them didn't even want to own the land. A lot of them just wanted to stay content as tenants. And you have that even today. Not a lot of people today want to own a house. A lot of people are very well content in renting for the rest of their lives. This is just as prevalent as it is back then as it is today. You know? All right. So it says, keep going here. In some cases, he worked for wages, but of those who were possessed of ability and ambition, entrepreneur-like, the larger part purchased small tracts of land and became freeholders. Virginia and Maryland, so far from being the region of huge plantations worked by scores of servants and slaves, were in large part divided up into comparatively small farms, tended solely by their owners. Okay? The most important factor in the life of these colonies during the 17th century was the sturdy yeomanry whose little plantations covered the face of the century. Okay? It has often been assumed that the Virginia land grants preserved in the registrar's office prove that the average plantation in the colony was of considerable extent. One historian has worked out the averages for many thousands of patents during the period from 1634 to 1650. Inclusive, the size of the average patent was 446 acres. From 1651 to 1700, inclusive, it was 674 acres. But the size of these grants did not coincide with the size of the average cultivated plantation. In both Virginia and Maryland, the patents were granted almost exclusively as a reward for bringing immigrants into the colonies. And any person who paid for the transportation, either of himself or of another, could claim his portion of acres. So they were giving people land. They're giving people land sizes based on how many people they can bring out here. That was how they kept the indenture system going in. So once these people came in out here on their ships and they worked for their freedom and became freedmen, they were given a grant of land. And that grant of land was, the size of that land was dependent on how many they were willing to help sponsor, come out, bring out here, and continue to have them working out there, and they'll have them working for them. So that's how that worked. All right, that's how the indentured system was working. All right, so let's go back up here. It says, in both Virginia and Maryland, the patents were granted almost exclusively as a reward for bringing immigrants into the colonies, and in any person who paid for the transportation, either of himself or of another, could claim his portion of acres. If it proved economical to bring in servants in small groups, the grants would be small. All right. If they came in large batches, the grants would be large. Okay. In Virginia, the patents ran all the way from 50 acres to 10,000 acres. All right. So we're going to go ahead and end it right here as we're getting close. Actually, yeah, we're right there. We're close to that 45-minute mark. So we're going to go ahead and end it right here. We're going to continue on in the next episode. But I just wanted to show you guys that these were the freedmen. So don't let nobody sit there and say, oh, we're all freedmen. We are we as so-called black people or the people that are fundamentally black or whatever they want to say nowadays. They got so many acronyms for it now. We are the freedmen. We are this, we are that. There's so many labels that's being pushed out there, but not enough research on these labels being done. And they show you right here in black and white what these terms actually meant and what they meant by it. Okay, so do your research. Continue to do your research. Don't let anybody call you something that you're not. We all know who we are, being the copper-colored Aborigines of America. Do your research and you will find that a lot of our people were not slaves. A lot of our people weren't enslaved to be free. A lot of our people owned land. We were farmers. We were the cultivators. We were the planters. All right? Some of us actually owned some servants, owned some slaves. Do your research and you will find that what you were told was actually told to you in reverse. Okay? So once again, Tatakista, I cherish y'all. Yakoki, thank you all for listening. This is Chief Steve signing off. Once again, as well, 400 strong. I really appreciate it. Let's continue to build. Let's continue to grow. And let's continue to learn. Make sure y'all like this video. Share to everybody that you know. If you're new, watching this for the first time, subscribe to the channel because we're going to keep it going. So, all right. I'm going to show you guys that video clip on the next video. So y'all be sure to watch out for that. Chief Steve signing off. Tatakista, I cherish y'all, and Yokoki. Thank you. See y'all next time.